If Robb Stark had decided to free Jaime Lannister early during the War of the Five Kings, the entire course of Westeros history would have shifted dramatically. In the original timeline, Jaime remained a valuable hostage, a bargaining chip Robb intended to use against Tywin Lannister. But if Robb, persuaded by Catelyn Stark or his own sense of honor, had released Jaime soon after capturing him, Tywin's reaction would have been immediate and brutal. Without Jaime as leverage, Robb would lose a significant advantage. Tywin, no longer constrained by the safety of his son, would unleash the full might of the Lannister armies on the Riverlands without hesitation. However, Jaime's early release would also alter Cersei's actions in King's Landing. Knowing her brother was safe, she would be more politically aggressive, likely consolidating power faster against threats like the Tyrells and Stannis. This, in turn, could deepen the conflict between the Lannisters and their supposed allies, while giving Robb less time to maneuver. The Northern Lords, already wary of Robb's decisions, might start questioning his leadership much sooner. Freeing Jaime early would make them see Robb as soft, dishonorable, and reckless, leading to cracks within his own camp. On the other side, Jaime himself would carry immense guilt and an even stronger sense of obligation. Freed earlier, he might have been sent directly back to Tywin, who would place him at the head of the Lannister forces. The Kingslayer would have been present at more battles, changing their outcomes entirely. Battles like Oxcross and the later confrontations could have gone very differently, possibly leading to Robb facing devastating defeats much earlier in the war. This single act, letting Jaime go, would also impact the Starks' alliances. House Frey, always calculating, would see Robb's decision as weakness and become even more hesitant to support him fully. Without strong leverage against the Lannisters, Robb's planned political marriages and deals would fall apart faster. The Red Wedding might not even happen the same way. Instead, Robb could be crushed militarily long before he ever reaches the Twins. Jaime's release could also speed up events in King's Landing involving Tyrion. If Jaime returned early, Tyrion might not have been named Hand of the King, changing his trajectory entirely. Without Tyrion's clever strategies during the Battle of Blackwater, Stannis Baratheon could have won and taken King's Landing, putting an entirely different king on the Iron Throne by the midpoint of the war in this alternate timeline. Freeing Jaime early creates a ripple effect where almost every major house adjusts its strategies. The North becomes fractured, the Lannisters grow stronger militarily, Stannis gains a better chance at victory, and Daenerys' eventual arrival to Westeros would face a completely different political landscape after Jaime Lannister's early release. The Stark camp would descend into quiet chaos. Many Northern lords, especially men like Lord Greyjohn, Umber, and Rickard Karstark, would view Robb's decision as a betrayal of the North's sacrifices. Karstark, whose sons were killed by Lannister men, would be the most vocal opponent. In the original timeline, his resentment boils slowly, but here it would explode much earlier. Karstark might even abandon Robb's cause outright, taking his forces back to Carhold and weakening the Stark army well before it faced Tywin's counterattack. Robb's bond with his mother, Catelyn Stark, would also suffer deeply, in canon. She frees Jaime much later in desperation to save Sansa and Arya, creating a rift between her and Robb. But if Robb himself had decided to release Jaime early, willingly and without forcing her hand, the blame would shift squarely onto him. His bannermen would question not just his strategy but his maturity as a king. Some might even begin whispering about abandoning his claim and returning north to defend their own lands rather than follow a young commander they believed acted foolishly. Meanwhile, Jaime's return to Tywin would trigger an entirely different chain of events. Tywin, relieved to have his heir back, would no longer need to divide his forces between defense and offense. He could mobilize his full strength against Robb immediately, likely reinforcing the Riverlands before Robb could secure them. Jaime, himself eager to prove his worth, would take command of several engagements, and with his battlefield experience, he could potentially turn early Lannister losses into victories. The Stark victories at battles like Whispering Wood and Oxcross might never happen at all, leaving the North's forces in a far weaker position from the start. In King's Landing, Cersei's newfound security with Jaime home would shift the court's balance of power. Without the vulnerability created by his capture, she would have more room to undermine Tyrion politically. This means Tyrion's influence could wane before he ever secures his position as acting hand of the king. Without Tyrion's leadership during the preparations for the Battle of Blackwater, Stannis Baratheon's invasion could succeed. A Lannister defeat at Blackwater would place Stannis on the Iron Throne, radically changing the future of the Seven Kingdoms. However, Jaime's presence at King's Landing would add another layer of intrigue. The Tyrells, seeing Jaime returned, and Tyrion weakened, might reconsider their alliance with the Lannisters entirely. They originally supported the Lannisters, largely out of necessity after Renly's death. But if Stannis looked poised to win and the Lannisters appeared divided, internally the Tyrells could choose to back a different claimant or delay committing their forces altogether. This would leave the Lannisters even more isolated than before. At the Wall, these events would indirectly affect Jon Snow's path. Without Robb's ongoing war holding the North's attention, Roose Bolton and other opportunistic houses might turn to their schemes faster. If the Lannisters were crushing Robb's forces earlier, Roose would begin aligning with Tywin far sooner, making Bolton betrayal inevitable, but this time with even more devastating consequences for the remaining Stark loyalists. Winterfell could fall to the Boltons well before Theon Greyjoy even attempts his capture, scattering the Stark children earlier and creating a harsher survival path for them. This alternate timeline begins showing its sharp edges. Robb's rule would crumble far earlier. Jaime would become Tywin's weapon instead of a prisoner, and Stannis might rise sooner than expected. The Starks, stripped of leverage and fractured by mistrust, would be staring down defeat long before the Red Wedding. With Jaime free much earlier, the pace of the war would accelerate, pushing Robb Stark into a corner faster than anyone anticipated. By this stage, Tywin Lannister would already have reorganized his armies, and with Jaime at his side, their strategy would shift from defense to overwhelming offense. Robb, without the leverage of Jaime's captivity, would find himself under constant pressure from both Tywin in the Riverlands and Roose Bolton's growing ambition within his own ranks by now. Rickard Karstark's fury would have boiled over. In this timeline, instead of simply plotting revenge, Karstark might openly defy Robb much earlier, perhaps even killing the Lannister prisoners far ahead of schedule. Robb, bound by honor, would face a terrible choice: execute Karstark for insubordination, or allow him to weaken Stark discipline further. Either decision would divide the Northern Lords. If Robb executed Karstark early, House Karstark would abandon his cause immediately, pulling away hundreds of men at a time when Robb desperately needed every sword. If he spared Karstark, the perception of weakness would deepen, pushing other bannermen to question his leadership and eroding his authority. Meanwhile, Jaime's presence on the battlefield would make a dramatic difference. At the Golden Tooth, Jaime would likely reclaim Lannister losses and inflict devastating defeats on Stark scouts and smaller forces. The battles that allowed Robb to gain his early reputation as the young wolf might vanish entirely. Without those stunning victories, Robb's image as an undefeated king never materializes, weakening his influence when negotiating alliances. House Frey, in particular, would take advantage of Robb's vulnerable position. In the original timeline, Walder Frey agrees to support Robb after being promised a marriage alliance, only to later betray him at the Red Wedding. But in this alternate timeline, Frey might refuse to support Robb at all, seeing him as a lost cause. Without Frey troops, Robb's numbers dwindle, forcing him to either retreat back north or make reckless moves to regain momentum. Mistakes Tywin would exploit ruthlessly in King's Landing. The ripple effects grow sharper, with Jaime back. Cersei would consolidate power faster, but her arrogance could clash harder with Tywin's control. Tyrion, without the political leverage his siblings' weaknesses gave him, might never rise to the position of acting hand. As a result, preparations for Stannis Baratheon's assault on King's Landing would be handled poorly. Stannis, already commanding a strong fleet, would find fewer traps awaiting him at Blackwater Bay. With no wildfire strategy from Tyrion, and no rallying speeches to inspire the defenders, the battle would likely end in Stannis' victory. If Stannis seized the Iron Throne at this stage, the entire dynamic of Westeros would shift. The Lannisters, though militarily powerful, would become outlaws against a legally recognized king. Tywin, enraged, might turn Jaime into his personal weapon of vengeance, focusing everything on tearing down Stannis while abandoning any remaining pretenses of diplomacy. The Reach and the Tyrells, who initially aligned with the Lannisters for power, might instead side with Stannis, seeing him as the stronger bet for survival. For the Stark children, these changes would be catastrophic. With Robb's position collapsing faster, Sansa's situation in King's Landing would become even more perilous. If Jaime returned early, Cersei would have less reason to treat Sansa delicately, meaning harsher conditions for her captivity. Arya, still wandering after fleeing Harrenhal, would have fewer northern victories to rely on for safety, making her journey far more dangerous. Winterfell too would suffer earlier. With the north divided, opportunistic forces like the Boltons and the Ironborn would act faster. Theon Greyjoy's betrayal might happen even sooner, but instead of seizing an unprotected Winterfell, he could face an already brewing Bolton coup. Roose Bolton, ever calculating, would accelerate his alignment with Tywin Lannister once he sensed Robb's inevitable defeat. By the end of this stage, the war would already be approaching a breaking point. Robb's forces would be fractured, Jaime would be leading victories for House Lannister, and Stannis' unexpected rise in King's Landing would create a three-way clash for dominance. Westeros would be set on a far bloodier, more unstable path than in the original timeline. By this stage of the alternate timeline, Robb Stark's campaign would be hanging by a thread. The early release of Jaime Lannister would have stripped Robb of his strongest bargaining chip, while his political missteps and military setbacks would have weakened his authority among both his allies and bannermen. Tywin Lannister, now fully focused on crushing the Stark rebellion, would unleash a relentless series of offensives, using Jaime's battlefield instincts and charisma to rally the Lannister armies. Robb, desperate to regain momentum, would be forced into a corner where bold risks seem like the only option. Without House Frey's full support, since Walder Frey likely never commits his troops in this version, Robb's forces would lack the numbers to face Tywin head-on. This would push him towards seeking alliances elsewhere. One possible path might involve strengthening ties with the Vale through his aunt Lysa Arryn, however. Lysa's paranoia and loyalty to Littlefinger would make such negotiations fragile at best. Littlefinger, always scheming, could exploit the situation, manipulating Lysa to remain neutral while secretly leaning toward whoever promises him greater influence, likely the Lannisters, given Jaime's return and Tywin's growing power. Meanwhile, Jaime's influence on Tywin's strategy would reshape the course of the war. In this reality, Jaime's early victories would solidify his reputation as a true battlefield commander, rather than just the infamous Kingslayer. Tywin, impressed by his son's successes, would trust him with even greater authority. Under Jaime's leadership, the Riverlands would likely fall much faster, with strongholds like Riverrun coming under heavy siege earlier than in the original timeline. The Tullys, cut off and without Robb's protection, could be forced into surrender, stripping Robb of another key ally. In King's Landing, the political landscape would continue to shift dramatically. With Jaime safely home, Cersei would be emboldened and far less inclined to tolerate Tyrion's presence. If Tyrion is sidelined before the Battle of Blackwater, Stannis' path to victory would become even clearer. Once Stannis captures the capital, the Iron Throne would fall under his control, forcing Tywin and Jaime into a two-front war, one against Stannis in the south and Robb in the north. However, Tywin, pragmatic as always, might instead seek a temporary truce with Stannis to focus entirely on annihilating the Starks first. Stannis, being stubborn and proud, would likely reject such an alliance, setting the stage for a deeper, bloodier conflict between the Baratheons and Lannister. In this chaos, the Tyrells, deprived of their marriage alliance with Joffrey, would bide their time, carefully assessing which side presents the greater long-term advantage. With Renly dead and Jaime returned, the Tyrells might cease as the safer bet and join him outright, giving his forces even greater strength against the weakened Lannisters. For Robb Stark, the situation in the north would deteriorate rapidly. Roose Bolton, sensing Robb's failures, would accelerate his betrayal and begin corresponding with Tywin much sooner than in the original timeline. Without Robb's significant battlefield victories to secure loyalty, Roose's scheming would gain traction among other opportunistic northern lords who fear the Lannisters' growing dominance. Winterfell, left vulnerable, would face threats from all sides: the Boltons, the Greyjoys, and even possible southern incursions. Sansa Stark's fate would also change drastically in this scenario, with Jaime back and Cersei holding stronger control over the court. Sansa would have far fewer chances to escape King's Landing. Littlefinger's plans to whisk her away might be delayed or even abandoned. By this point in the alternate timeline, the War of the Five Kings would look very different. Robb Stark's cause would be near collapse, and the North would be fracturing under internal and external pressures. Jaime Lannister's early release would have accelerated Tywin's dominance, and with Stannis Baratheon now likely seated on the Iron Throne after his Blackwater victory, Westeros would effectively be divided between two rising powers: Stannis in the south and the Lannisters in the west, while the Starks desperately try to hold on in the north. Robb, stripped of leverage and political influence, would face a cruel reality. With fewer troops after losing House Karstark and possibly House Frey's open support, his only chance of survival would be diplomacy. Robb might attempt sending envoys to Stannis, hoping to secure an alliance against the Lannisters. However, Stannis' rigid belief in his claim to the Iron Throne would make such negotiations nearly impossible unless Robb bent the knee and swore loyalty. For Robb, raised to defend the North's independence, this would be unthinkable. But as his bannermen lose faith, whispers would grow louder. Maybe kneeling to Stannis is the only way to save the North from total destruction. Meanwhile, Jaime's reputation would be at its peak. His leadership on the battlefield and his early victories would transform him into the Lannisters' greatest weapon, overshadowing even Tywin's legendary strategic mind. This newfound prominence could also strain his relationship with Cersei. In this timeline, Cersei would feel Jaime slipping further from her control as he earns Tywin's respect and the admiration of their bannermen. Her paranoia would intensify, pushing her into even more dangerous political maneuvers, possibly turning on allies, like the Tyrells, much earlier than in the original timeline. Speaking of the Tyrells, their position would be complicated. Without Joffrey's betrothal and with Stannis controlling King's Landing, Margaery's marriage prospects would shift dramatically. The Tyrells might seek to wed Margaery to Stannis' heir, or even forge an alliance with the Martells of Dorne to secure their survival. Either way, the Reach would remain a key power broker in deciding the outcome of the larger conflict in the Riverlands. The devastation would be nearly complete. Riverrun, isolated and besieged without Robb's protection, would eventually fall. Edmure Tully might be captured, forcing House Tully into submission. Arya Stark, who originally found a network of protection through northern victories, would instead find herself wandering in a land almost entirely under Lannister control. Without the Brotherhood, without banners gaining strength against a weakened Lannister presence, Arya's road would be harsher, forcing her to rely more on her instincts and violent tendencies to survive. Winterfell's fate would be even more tragic. With Robb distracted and weakened, Roose Bolton would accelerate his betrayal, coordinating with Tywin much earlier. This could set up a scenario where Bolton seizes Winterfell before Theon Greyjoy even attempts his takeover. In this timeline, Theon's plans would fail completely, and instead of capturing Winterfell, he might be forced into retreat, shamed before Balon Greyjoy and branded a failure. The Boltons, in control of the Stark stronghold far earlier, would solidify their influence in the north well before Robb could respond. Meanwhile, beyond the wall, Jon Snow's path would shift subtly but significantly, with the north embroiled. In chaos sooner, the Night's Watch would receive less support and fewer reinforcements. As the threat of the White Walkers grows, Jon would find himself even more isolated, facing Mance Rayder's army without the hope of northern aid. If the Lannisters and Stannis are locked in a power struggle further south, the wall's defenses could be dangerously undermined, paving the way for the others to advance far earlier than in the original timeline. By the end of this part, West would be a fractured, unstable realm. Stannis Baratheon would sit on the Iron Throne, but his control would be tenuous, constantly challenged by Tywin and Jaime's Lannister armies. Robb Stark, once the North's great hope, would stand on the brink of total defeat, his forces scattered and his bannermen divided. Betrayals would come faster, alliances would shift constantly, and the true war for survival against both men and the coming winter would be far bloodier and more chaotic than ever. By this stage of the alternate timeline, Westeros would be in the midst of a full-scale power struggle, and the consequences of Robb Stark freeing Jaime Lannister early would be felt everywhere. The balance of power would be drastically different from the original events, with Stannis Baratheon on the Iron Throne, Jaime emerging as a military hero, Tywin tightening his grip on the West, and Robb's rebellion nearly crumbling. But even with Robb weakened, the North's fate would remain uncertain, caught between betrayal, political chaos, and the looming threat of winter. After Riverrune's inevitable fall under Jaime's command, the Riverlands would be firmly under Lannister control. This would send shockwaves through the Northern Lords, who would now see Robb as a king who cannot protect his allies. Many bannermen, already disillusioned after Karstark's rebellion, would begin abandoning his cause entirely. Some, like the Manderleys and the Glovers, might choose neutrality, while others, fearing the wrath of Tywin, would secretly begin negotiating with the Lannisters through Roose Bolton, seeing an opportunity to secure his power, would accelerate his betrayal far earlier than in the original timeline. Unlike at the Red Wedding, where he strikes after careful planning, here he would position himself as a loyal servant of Tywin much sooner, feeding him information about Robb's movements while quietly consolidating Bolton influence across the north. By this point, Winterfell could already be under Bolton control, making House Stark's grip on its ancestral seat vanish without resistance. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Stannis' early victory would create its own storm. Though he would claim the Iron Throne, his position would not be secure. Stannis' rigid adherence to law and his alliance with Melisandre would alienate many powerful families in the Crownlands and beyond. The faith of the Seven would grow uneasy under Melisandre's growing influence, while lords loyal to the old Lannister regime would begin plotting rebellions in the shadows. Stannis' paranoia, combined with his iron-fisted rule, would make his court even more unstable than Joffrey's ever was. Jaime Lannister, now free and thriving as Tywin's right hand, would command the respect of the West's armies. However, his growing reputation could spark tension between him and his father. Tywin, calculating and prideful, might grow wary of Jaime, overshadowing him in both glory and influence. Cersei, meanwhile, would spiral further into paranoia and resentment, watching Jaime rise as a hero while she loses control over him. Their relationship, so central to their early schemes, would fracture under the weight of Jaime's new loyalty to Tywin's vision rather than Cersei's desires. Farther south, the Tyrells would play a dangerous waiting game. With Stannis ruling from the Iron Throne but lacking widespread support, the Reach would see an opportunity to position itself as the realm's kingmaker. The Tyrells might begin secret negotiations with Dorne, plotting a future where they could overthrow Stannis and establish a claimant more favorable to their influence. Margaery Tyrell, no longer betrothed to Joffrey, could become the centerpiece of these political games, a bargaining chip the Tyrells could use to secure power with either Stannis or even the Lannisters if the tides turned. For the Stark children, this period would be one of their darkest trials. Sansa, still trapped in King's Landing under Stannis' reign, would face even more danger than under the Lannisters. Stannis might see her as a political pawn, using her as leverage over Northern loyalty. Arya, wandering through the Riverlands, would now be in even greater peril, with no brotherhood without banners to protect her, and most of the region under Lannister control. Her path to Braavos, and ultimately becoming faceless, might still happen, but it would be lonelier, bloodier, and far more brutal. Beyond the Wall, the situation would grow dire. With the North's political collapse, the Night's Watch would be neglected even earlier, leaving Jon Snow and his brothers with fewer resources to face the growing wildling threat and the White Walkers. If Stannis is consumed with southern politics and the Lannisters are locked in battle with him, the Wall's defenders would be on their own when Mance Rayder's massive host arrives. Without southern reinforcements, the Night's Watch could suffer catastrophic losses, paving the way for the White Walkers' invasion far sooner than in the original timeline. By the end of this stage, Westeros would stand at the By this point in the alternate timeline, Westeros would be a land completely engulfed in chaos. Robb Stark's rebellion would be effectively shattered. Stannis Baratheon would hold the Iron Throne but face widespread resistance, and Jaime's early release would have transformed him into Tywin's most trusted commander and political weapon. However, the deeper consequences of this altered chain of events would now begin to fully unfold, setting the stage for a far more dangerous and unpredictable war. Robb Stark, now stripped of most of his forces and allies, would be left with only a handful of loyal bannermen, perhaps the great Jon Galbart, Glover, and a few smaller houses still clinging to the hope of independence. With Riverrun fallen, the Karstarks gone, and House Frey refusing to lend support, Robb would be pushed into hiding rather than continuing open battle. This could lead him to retreat toward the north, aiming to consolidate whatever power remained there. But even this path would be fraught with peril because Roose Bolton, having already betrayed him earlier in this timeline, would have secured Winterfell and declared his loyalty to the Lannisters far sooner. In this fractured north, loyalties would splinter rapidly. Some houses, like the Manderleys, would secretly plot against the Boltons, while outwardly swearing fealty to them, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Others, fearing Lannister retribution, would bend the knee to Tywin and Jaime without hesitation. Without a unified northern leadership, the region would fall into chaos long before winter fully descended, leaving it vulnerable not only to southern incursions but also to external threats like the White Walkers. Meanwhile, Jaime Lannister's victories would reshape House Lannister's standing in West. Once mocked as the Kingslayer, Jaime's military success would earn him respect across the realm. Tywin would capitalize on his son's new image, using Jaime to forge alliances and secure loyalty among wavering lords. However, this growing fame would drive a wedge between Jaime and Cersei. In this reality, Cersei's paranoia would become even more destructive. Convinced that Jaime was slipping out of her control and being molded into Tywin's perfect heir, her resentment could drive her into increasingly reckless schemes, targeting both Jaime supporters and any house she viewed as a threat in King's Landing. Stannis' rule would become dangerously unstable. While he held the throne, his iron-fisted policies, fueled by Melisandre's influence, would alienate many powerful houses. Lords who once pledged fealty to the crown would grow restless under the shadow of R'hllor's fiery faith. The faith of the Seven, threatened by Melisandre's growing power, would begin quietly rallying behind a resistance movement within the capital. Open rebellion against Stannis would be inevitable, forcing him to split his forces between holding King's Landing and combating Tywin's growing strength in the west. The Tyrells, caught between two giants, would see an opportunity to strengthen their influence. Without Margaery's betrothal to Joffrey and with Stannis ruling the south, the Reach would carefully bide its time, maintaining the appearance of neutrality while quietly negotiating with both sides. Ultimately, the Tyrells might even approach Daenerys Targaryen, once word of her dragons spreads across Essos, hoping to secure a future alliance with the Mother of Dragons as the realm continues tearing itself apart. Farther north, Jon Snow's situation would worsen dramatically. With the Northern Lords divided and Robb's rebellion dying, the Night's Watch would be left entirely isolated. Mance Rayder's wildling army would advance with little opposition, and Jon would be forced into an even more desperate leadership role. If the wall were to fall this early, the chaos in the south would ensure no reinforcements came to stop the White Walkers' advance. The war for survival beyond the wall would merge into the southern conflicts much sooner, creating a catastrophe no one in Westeros would be prepared for. Meanwhile, Arya Stark's transformation would accelerate in this darker reality. Surrounded by Lannister-controlled riverlands and facing constant danger, she would have no brotherhood without banners to protect her, and no time to linger. Her journey to Braavos would likely come sooner, pushing her training with the Faceless Men years ahead of schedule. This faster progression could make Arya far deadlier by the time the Great Wars reached their climax. By now, Westeros would be divided into 3 unstable power centers: Stannis' fragile southern rule, Tywin and Jaime's rising dominance in the west, and the remnants of the northern resistance scattered across hostile territory. Every alliance would be temporary, every betrayal devastating, and all the while, the true existential threat, the White Walkers, would creep closer to the realm while the great houses remain blinded by their endless war. By this final stage of the alternate timeline, Westeros would be spiraling into a far darker, bloodier, and more unstable future than ever imagined. Robb Stark's decision to free Jaime Lannister early, an act born of honor, hope, or desperation, would have shattered the balance of power and set off a chain reaction that no one could control. The 7 kingdoms would now stand divided into multiple camps, each weakened by betrayal, mistrust, and exhaustion, while the true enemy beyond the wall prepared to strike. Robb Stark, once the young wolf and a symbol of northern pride, would now be reduced to a fugitive king. With Riverrun fallen, Winterfell seized by Roose Bolton, and his forces scattered, Robb would be left wandering the north, clinging to a dwindling dream of independence. Some loyal bannermen would remain by his side, but his strength would no longer lie in armies. It would lie in survival and small-scale resistance. Robb could become more of a guerrilla commander than a king, striking quickly at Bolton supply lines, raiding Lannister outposts, and inspiring whispers of rebellion even as his formal war collapses. Yet, without sufficient allies, his days as a major political power would be numbered. Meanwhile, House Bolton would rise far sooner than in the original timeline, thanks to their early betrayal. By securing Winterfell under Tywin's protection, Roose Bolton would cement himself as Warden of the North much earlier, ruling with cruelty and fear. Ramsay Bolton's savagery would be unleashed, unchecked, devastating small northern houses, and crushing Stark loyalists before they could regroup. However, the Boltons' power would be precarious. The Manderleys, Glovers, and other proud northern families would secretly bide their time, waiting for the right moment to overthrow their new masters. In the south, King Stannis Baratheon would continue struggling to hold his throne. Melisandre's influence would grow unchecked, leading to mass burnings of heretics and deep unrest among the faith of the Seven. Entire regions, already wary of Stannis' rigid authority, would openly revolt. While Stannis commanded discipline and respect, his numbers would dwindle as more houses defect to the Lannisters, viewing Jaime's victories and Tywin's growing power as the safer bet. Eventually, Stannis would face a brutal choice: abandon King's Landing and consolidate power at Dragonstone, or fight a two-front war against both Tywin and internal rebellions. Jaime Lannister, now at the height of his power and reputation, would emerge as one of the most dangerous figures in Westeros. His command of the Lannister armies and his transformation into a respected general would shift the realm's perception of him from disgraced Kingslayer to conquering hero. Tywin, however, would continue to manipulate Jaime's victories for political gain, forging alliances with wavering houses and consolidating power across the Westerlands, the Riverlands, and potentially even the Reach. Yet tensions within the Lannister family would worsen. Cersei's paranoia, jealousy, and resentment over Jaime's growing independence would drive her into reckless schemes that risked destabilizing their newfound power. The Tyrells, masters of patience and ambition, would seize this chaos to strengthen their position. If Stannis' rule weakened further, they could rally the Reach under the banner of independence, refusing to swear fealty to either the Iron Throne or the Lannister. Quiet negotiations with Dawn, and whispers of potential support for Daenerys Targaryen, now steadily growing stronger across the Narrow Sea, would set the stage for a much larger realignment of power once dragons entered the game. But beyond all the wars of men, the greatest threat would be growing in silence. With the North fractured and the Night's Watch under assault, Mance Rayder's wildling army would break through the wall much earlier in this timeline. If Castle Black fell without southern reinforcements, the White Walkers would begin their march into the Seven Kingdoms years before anyone expected. By the time the Southern Lords recognized the true danger, it would already be too late. Their armies weakened, their alliances shattered, and their kingdoms unprepared for the winter's endless dead. In this alternate history, Jaime's early release would ultimately lead to chaos on a scale far greater than in the original timeline. Robb Stark's dream of independence would burn away. Stannis' reign would fracture the South. The Lannisters would rise higher only to be consumed by internal conflict, and the rest of Westeros would fall into constant shifting alliances and betrayals. But while kings and queens fought endlessly for thrones and crowns, the true war, the one between the living and the dead, would arrive much earlier and far deadlier than anyone could have imagined. This ending leaves Westeros in a fragile, volatile state, where survival itself would become the ultimate battle. Every house would face a single, terrifying reality. Their endless political games had blinded them to the greater threat, and by the time they realized the truth, winter would already have swallowed them whole.